Welcome to What's Your Point with Colin Barnes and Graham Mills. In this series of podcasts, we will use a famous statement or quote from the world of sport to start our conversation and bring light to a topic. Our goal is to dispel myths and make the truth stick. Come join us in the discussion. The first quote we delve into comes from a recent signing to the Premier League, Thiago Silva. In his first press conference after joining Chelsea, the recent Champions League runner-up from PSG said this: "I'd never really seen myself in the Premier League previously because I saw it as a difficult style of football personally. I didn't have any desire to play in the Premier League because my impression was that the football being played was of long balls. At the time, I couldn't see myself playing in that league. I'd seen it as being characterized by long balls, and that didn't really appeal to me. I know how to play that way, but my preference was to play football on the ground. I knew my quality. But little by little, the Premier League has really won me over, and anyone who knows me can confirm that."
Hi Colin.
Hey Graham.
So today we're going to have a look at or discuss Thiago Silva's recent statement around English football being synonymous with a long ball style of play. So probably if we start from sort of unpicking that from, you're an American coach coming to England. What was your perception of the English game prior to coming here?
Oh, it is traditional 4-4-2, and in fact, many of the English coaches that we grew up in the '90s playing for them, and my professional coach. We played a 4-4-2, and if your outside backs get the ball, right back, left back, it's going to the forward, and you're having to play off of it. And so my career was spent around looking over to where the ball was going next, and felt like I was a tennis spectator at mid-court or at the net. So long ball football was the way, but at the same time, my dad brought me up on videos, so I got to see the United championship game against Benfica, the Eintracht Frankfurt, and Real Madrid from Glasgow, and you kind of had an idea of what football was back then, but certainly the aspects of the pitch being as muddy, the weather being atrocious. There might have been reasons for those long ball tactics, and but certainly that was the stereotype, and probably rightfully so.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of things that played or had an influence into the way that English football was perceived, and the stigma that maybe has been attached to the English game for a number of years. And like you say, the climate being one of them. So quite a wet climate generally, pitches heavy, muddy pitches. Naturally, the inclination was to get the ball as far forward as possible, it being an invasion game, and therefore taking the surface out of the equation almost. Add to that sort of cultural things around the English mentality, being quite high energy, the Premier League being now regarded as one of the most physical leagues. So there's probably a number of factors that play into that. And then obviously there was an important document in 1990. Charles Hughes, who was the technical director of the FA at the time, almost sort of validated that approach, that direct style. So probably there's cultural, there's climate-ish things, there was things that influenced the inclination to play direct, but then it was that winning formula book or manual that came out that probably then validated it and gave practitioners sort of the not the excuse but the confirmation that it was the way forward, because a lot of it was based on analytics. So there was proof within that document to say we should play direct, and these are the reasons for it, and it was backed up by statistics. Yeah. So then a lot of coaches that were working in the game at the time obviously took that information and then continued to apply it.
How did England do in the '90 World Cup? I forget.
the 90 World Cup was semi-finals, wasn't it?
So right around that time, we're playing long ball, we're successful, it's 1-0 results across the board, and when you, as you said, the validation gets put in there if your national team is having success on the biggest stage.
Yeah. So obviously in that era as well, you had players like Gascoigne as well, so creative players. So you probably have quite a pragmatic framework in terms of 4-4-2, trying to go from back to front as quickly as possible, and trying to play off a more advanced platform. But then obviously how as a coach do you try and knit someone like Gascoigne with his attributes and qualities into that? And whilst Gascoigne achieved a lot in his career, you sort of think in a different era, in today's game, what could he have done, what could he have been? But yeah, it's I guess his document, Charles Hughes, influenced the game probably for the next 20 years, certainly a decade. And you look at a lot of English teams of that era, sort of early to late 90s, the advent of the Premier League coming in 92. I think probably with the Premier League then becoming a global brand and being seen all around the world, it probably then reinforced that stigma of English football being quite robust and rugged and direct. So Thiago Silva, if watching as a young player, probably would have seen that, and that may have formed that impression of what English football was like. And there was probably an era where that stayed, I would imagine, until the influence of more foreign coaches started to come into the Premier League, and maybe started to break that sort of reputation down a little bit and maybe challenge it. But I certainly think even though foreign managers were coming in, they were probably it was hard work for them to break down that. I think it had become quite synonymous with English football at that point. I've been to sort of study visits, and I've spoke to coaches in other countries, and the first thing they ask is around about long style football, or they'll talk about the traditional number 9, English number 9, or 4-4-2. So yeah, I certainly think the winning formula was probably something that really was a catalyst for endorsing that style for English football, and that probably lasted for a while.
Yeah, I distinctly remember I was at university, so this must have been the late 90s, and the comments were all, even for the Alex Ferguson Great United teams, the comment was always coming out, well, that style doesn't suit continental football. So you could never, the English teams were always having a difficult time. Why are they losing to these nobody, in their eyes, nobody teams in Champions League? And, they're finding it hard for the tactics to be able to adapt to what was going on, or the style of play. And, I'm guessing around that time is when the transition, when the Wengers came in, started to have success. As you said, those managers, the more that came in and the more that had success within the Premier League, the easier it was to change those tactics. So it wasn't Pep's come in and he's definitely made everyone play this one style. It's a little bit more subtle than that. It's the Espiritos or at Wolves, being able to bring in people that you might not win every day. It's the other managers that come in that help change that culture, as you said. Yeah,
I think if you're trying to influence change, the biggest platform or the best platform to do it from is from a winning position. So if you can come in and be Arsene Wenger and win something, then obviously it gives creditation to the change that you're trying to introduce, and then you can get more people to follow. If he came in and struggled and had a difficult time, obviously a lot of people would say, well, that doesn't work, not in this country, this is the English game and we play a certain way. But obviously him coming in and being quite influential in the way that he approached the game and some of the things that he introduced, the methodology, things around diet, sports science. Obviously, on the back of that winning I think won a Premier League double, had the Invincibles. Obviously it will invoke change, or at least people that are willing to explore what he's doing and maybe adapt some of his methodology and approaches. So I think that was an important turning point with more foreign coaches coming in with ideas. I think probably another key sort of turning point in this was, like you say, the Champions League and the importance, or the increased importance, of European football. Even if you go back to sort of Nottingham Forest and the Clough, had success on the European stage, and then you would look at maybe teams like Watford later with Graham Taylor going into Europe. They really struggled, and whilst they might be dominant in the Premier League playing a certain way, like you say, on the continent it was a different style. It's more patient, their press might be more coordinated, it might be less on physical attributes and more on tactical positional play, whatever it might be. So I think that was a significant change as well, because English teams wanted to start getting into Europe and dominating Europe and having an impact in European competitions, and they were finding that the English game didn't necessarily work, so they had to adapt and change. And I think Ferguson is quoted as saying that they had to have a different way of playing when it came to European competition.
Yeah.
Obviously the biggest eye-opener for him was the Barcelona, towards the end of his career, the final against Barcelona in Rome, where probably one of the best performances from Guardiola's team. There's probably been quite a slow sea change, but I think the style of English football is now starting to change. Now, in terms of the development of players to be able to cope with that change and be able to play that way, one important thing was the Charter for Quality, which was slightly later than Charles Hughes' book, so it was 1997. Howard Wilkinson, who I think he's still the last English manager to win the top division. So he was the technical director at the time, and he oversaw this Charter for Quality. So it came in and it wanted to sort of avoid fragmentation within the English game and try to achieve a sense of quality and unity. Because at the time, school football took priority. So if you were a talented player at a football club, then school football was the priority. So clubs were probably seeing less of their players and having less contact time. So the idea was to try and join things up. So there were sort of chartered schools or charter mark schools and things like that. So I think they had a few overriding things they wanted to achieve. So maximum participation, they wanted to increase ethical standards and education and welfare for players. So there was a number of things that came in to really professionalise youth football, because up until that point it perhaps wasn't, and that was probably part of the reason why the production line of players wasn't quite there. So when this came in 97, it had been 30 years since England had won a national competition. So the emphasis was to try and have a more joined up pathway so that more international success could be realised.
Yeah, and that's on the back end of the Euros in '96, where football was coming home, but yet couldn't bring it in. The odd thing about that is, as the American coming in with a different pathway. I remember reading Roy Keane's biography. I had to hear about how he, tore someone's knee up and it stood over top of him. So I read the whole thing, of course, and it was bizarre to hear his pathway. He had a school team that he was playing matches on in a day.
Yeah.
He had this county team that he was going to play matches, and then he had his club team. And we talk about overuse injuries. We talk about playing too much and exhaustion and all that kind of stuff. And no, back in those days, that's kind of what it's. So that was obviously the turning point to get a hold of coordinated effort to have, when games were playing, when you're training. Makes sense.
Yeah, so they tried to formalise a formal games program, and there was two distinctions. There was an academy, So if you think of now with the EPPP, which we'll come on to, Cat 1s, so that was almost what academies were under the Charter for Quality. So certain level of facilities, certain number of staff, contact hours, and then there were Centre of Excellences, so you're either an academy or a Centre of Excellence. So I think just touching on what you said about Roy Keane's number of games that he would play, the Charter for Quality brought in a rule or a ratio of 4-1, so 4 hours of development and 1 hour of competitive football, because they saw it problematic that a lot of young players from the age of 7 were involved in lots and lots of competitive games, but perhaps didn't have enough time to develop and refine through contact time with coaches. So that was one of the things that they brought in. There was staffing levels that clubs had to adhere to. They introduced a travel rule. So for certain ages it was an hour, similar to today's rules with foundation phase and youth development. But it was an hour for, I think it was up to 13s at the time, and then above that an hour and a half travel time. And there were certain waivers to that rule as well. So if you were lived by the coast and some of your travel time or your catchment area was consumed by the sea, then there would be opportunities for you to extend that and have a satellite centre, for example. So Southampton has got their academy here in Southampton, and then they've got a satellite centre in Bath, and that would stem back from the Charter for Quality. Mm-hmm. Similarly, if you're in an urban area like London and it takes 2 hours to get from one side of the city to the other in rush hour traffic, then you could also have a satellite centre to compensate for that. So there were certain rules that came in which are still in place today, but it probably was the first sort of standpoint from the FA to really professionalise youth development in the country. Before then it was very ad hoc, very disjointed, and this tried to streamline the whole process.
And coincidentally or corresponding at that time frame in America, we were finding that our 16s were pretty good at the international level compared to the rest of the world. Anytime it was up to I think 17s, but we always struggled after that. And so right around 96, the Nick Bollettieri School down in Bradenton, Florida, that's now turned into the IMG Academy, they started housing their national team. So they became a residency program. And so they started competing at the semi-professional level with the 17-year-olds. So if you were good enough at 17 to be in the national pool, they'd start bringing in. Only until, I want to say about 3 years ago, they had that residency program. So the Landon Donovans of the world came through there. DeMarcus Beasley, some well-known internationals and pros that played. And that was the extent of the pathway, was just youth. Basically just youth internationals training together. And so they're a little bit behind, but it's kind of around the same time that people around the world were noticing, okay, we need to have more of a policy influence on how development is being done to ensure that things are going at the right level or within the right parameters.
Yeah, and I think that's so this was governed, the EPPP obviously was instigated by the Premier League with stakeholders. The Charter for Quality was the FA, so the national governing body. This was sort of driven by them, and they would do like an audit check 3 times a year, and then an annual review, just to assess what was being done to make sure that child welfare, screening was being done. They were given opportunities for education, and it sort of started to bring in that holistic approach to development, which probably prior to this there wasn't really great deal of regard for. It was more about you're a young football player, not necessarily seeing them as a young person and an athlete. I think what probably stimulated this was it was driven by some research into clubs abroad, to find out what they were doing, how many hours they were doing, some of the sort of provision that they were offering to their young players. So Ajax, Barcelona, Parma, Inter Milan and Sao Paulo were the clubs that they looked at, and from that then informed how they were going to introduce youth development in this country. So as well as the 4-to-1 ratio, also players couldn't play more than 30 games a season. So there were rules like that weren't in place before. Older players, it was slightly more, they were able to play more competitive games, but it was a more age and stage appropriate view of youth development. And a lot of these things have been kept in place now with what's going on with the EPPP. But it's that's probably one of the biggest things in terms of going back to Thiago's statement of his understanding of English football was about long ball, and now he's more comfortable to play in this country because he feels that sort of stigma has changed and it's not necessarily true. Probably one of the key points was, well, we need to develop players that are good enough and can play that way. And the professionalisation of youth development through the Charter for Quality was probably the start point for that. And then moving forward, the influence of Spain and countries like that have shown there is a different way to play and be successful.
Yeah, it's how other countries do things. I think you brought up a point earlier about success breeds magpies. We make that general statement in the coaching world that you need to be a good magpie. You need to be able to take something from someone else and try it yourself and make it into your own. Well, the same is being done on the global scale at the the biggest level at the football associations from around the countries. And so that next step, and especially a good look with Thiago being the consummate Brazilian, the next piece of literature impact was Ford and all in 2012, but the actual meat of the study that's been influencing most of this, the Charter for Quality kind of instigated what we should be looking at. So the researchers for this study went into different countries. So you got Brazil, England, Mexico, Portugal, Ghana, and France, and they wanted to take a look at what are the elite level players doing, what was their pathway, how many hours. So this contact hours is a centerpiece of what we should be doing, and I think that's going to definitely be central to the EPPP when we get to that. But the way that we as developers of children and seeing their growth and maturity come through divide up these hours into three main components, and the first one's practice, deliberate practice, and that's kind of defined as players are being trained by an adult with a purpose in mind. And then there's deliberate play, and so obviously that's where children are playing on their own. And the best example is this idea of the Brazilian kids that are playing futsal on their own. They're out out playing beach soccer. They're out playing in the yard. And anytime you talk to someone who is older, and they tell their age, go, oh, back in my day, we were out in the streets playing together. We were doing pickup games. And for some reason, we all say that. And our grandparents and elders told us that we sit around and we play too many video games. We are all complaining about that with our kids that we coach, that we're trying to coerce them to get off of a device so they can go and actually play on their own, organize a tournament by themselves, so we aren't the ones that are doing that. In fact, we do that at a training session. It's mind-blowing that we've gotten to that point that we're trying to replicate this play because we know how important it is. And then there's when does competition, competitive competition. So those three areas are looked at, and especially amongst these countries, and they are all indicators of different aspects. So if you have lots of practice, at an early age, we call that early specialization. If there's lots of play amongst a lot of different sports, then that's early diversification. And then if there's less competition and you're getting into a sport, it's going to be called early engagement. So there's a little bit of a difference between the specialization and diversification in that you're not playing as much with other sports. You're doing so as a footballer, you'd be playing futsal. It's another sport, but it's still directed at football. So these three things were looked at by the elites, and one of the biggest things that was found was that Brazil, compared to all of the other countries, had so much more play time. Their elite players started at a much later age in practice. And obviously it has not changed the elite players at the highest level, whether it's the internationals or whether it's the amount of Brazilians that are playing in top leagues around the world. The one that kind of stayed the same was competition. Everyone kind of started playing games at the same time. And so when this was done in 2010, it was much different because of the Charter for Quality. Because when I grew up, I don't know about you, I played 5 games in 2 days, sometimes 6 games in 2 days over a weekend because we were in a tournament, and that's kind of fallen by the wayside. There's still some of these tournaments going on, but not to the extent that we were doing it. So, I mean, it is a case that when we take the English players compared to, especially the Brazilians, the early specialization occurs. We tend to, especially with EPPP, we get our kids at U9, and that's in America as well. Academy, they call them academy players. There is that U9 age group, and even with the EPPP that we'll get to, they're bringing them in, working with them at U5 at a developmental level, of course, but all of the elite players, they started practicing roughly around the same time. The abnormal one was the Brazilians. So for Thiago to say, well, England's always been known for this long ball, we also have to take into consideration what his upbringing, his culture was. He was playing and doing his thing up until about 13 and 14, and then that's the average age when the Brazilians finally go into an academy setup, and from there they start training regimentally, and they put in a lot more practice hours from 14 and up because they had obviously been playing in other sports or without coaching or training prior to that.
I guess that's probably, whilst there was lots of positives to the Charter for Quality, that might be one of the negatives in that it did perhaps encourage more of an early specialisation model, prior to that with schools taking priority, so young players could play across different sports for their school. If the clubs wanted to have more contact time, invest their resources, have them working with their coaches and have more control, obviously they're starting to specialise a little bit earlier. So they're coming into the academies and having more contact time with them. So that might be one of the downsides of it. And also probably the coaches, because we're talking 1997. That's only 7 years after Charles Hughes's winning formula was produced, and this is the way forward for English football. So a lot of those coaches that under nines may have been working with, whilst it was in better facilities and the safeguarding was a lot better, probably what they're teaching from a technical and tactical perspective is probably derived from what Charles Hughes was saying. So there's probably pros and cons to it, and that may have just enforced more of a long ball style football from a younger age with earlier specialisation, premature professional sort of approach. That one of the other things that was interesting from the Charter for Quality before we move on to the next bit would be that they had everything seemed to be, there was quotas and numbers that academies and centre of excellences needed to adhere to. So in the under-9s, for example, they could only sign a maximum of 40 players. And then that would then taper off, and then they'd get to sort of youth team and only be able to register 15 players. So now you look at clubs, let's use Thiago Silva's new club, Chelsea, where it's almost now gone the other extreme, where it's almost stockpiling players and sending them out on loan and other different strategies around that. So the Charter for Quality wasn't about the numbers game and getting the most in as possible and trying to develop the masses to the elite level. It was hopefully to try and get the select few and develop them. And that was probably one of the problems with the Charter for Quality, because I think Howard Wilkinson anticipated a few clubs to go for academy status. Maybe it's sort of a northern hub of clubs, the Liverpools, the Manchester Uniteds, some Midland clubs, and then some southern clubs. Maybe one in each region or two in each region. But what actually happened was a vast number of clubs applied for academy status and achieved it. So it almost watered down the product that he was aiming for. And I guess we've seen that now with the EPPP, with the number of Cat 1 clubs. The idea was the best with the best, in the best facilities, with the best coaches. That elite pathway through to national team. And it probably hasn't really materialised, because it's more clubs have achieved that status, which is great for clubs because they're offering fantastic resources and stuff. But ultimately now there's a lot of choice, so we're not getting the best with the best as often or as regular as maybe anticipated.
Yeah, I mean, if we could easily throw a monkey wrench into that argument just by saying, what about late developers? And we'll get into that one at another time. And this is the part about the conversation and the dialogue, is it's never, we want to peel it back one layer at a time and kind of address one issue. Well, this whole holistic thing means that it's intertwined with everything, and you talk about one aspect, and it actually we're talking about other things as well. And one thing that I know I've kind of ignored, and I had to be reminded, when I hear the word or the phrase, centers of excellence, that was a term that we used in America as and of course our Brit coaches brought it over and tried to use it within the youth systems there. But now the context, in parallel with what's going on the men's side or the boys' side, is how it's being still used on the girls' side and the women's side, and how centers of excellence are still used. That's the pathway. That's how these clubs are developing the next women's game. So obviously, there is an understanding, there's an assumption. We're talking about the men's game. We're talking about the Premier League. That's the men's game. There are obviously women's leagues going on. There's women's development, and we don't always need to neglect or just assume they're not there. But I find it interesting that they're just that much a little bit behind. Is that if we're saying that centers of excellence happened in 97 and didn't get changed until 2011-12, then the girls are almost a decade behind the boys, which is great that there's more notoriety, and sad at the same time. But obviously the advent of the Premier League by far has fueled the need and the resources and the funding to make change, and that leads in, as you alluded to earlier, the FA caused one big shift in development. Well, now it leads into the Premier League going, we have an issue going on. The
interesting thing with the Charter for Quality is it actually does talk about women's football in there. It talks about centre of excellences in the female game, which obviously the Premier League doesn't, the EPPP doesn't talk about the women's game. So that's a real good thing about the Charter for Quality, and that may be where it stemmed from, the centre of excellence. And also the Charter for Quality was emphasised the importance of community links as well. So holiday camps and things like that, and maintaining connection with your local community. So there seemed to be some really good stuff around that in the Charter for Quality. I guess the point about the women's game being 10 years behind, that's also probably true of some centre of excellences further down the league hierarchy, if you like. I started at Bournemouth and they were a centre of excellence, so they weren't an academy under the Charter for Quality. So Southampton, for example, were an academy. So from 98, when the Charter for Quality really kicked off, they were an academy. So when the EPPP then came in 2012, Southampton had been an academy from that point for 12 years.
Yeah.
So, 12? 14 years. So they've been 14 years as an academy, and Bournemouth have been a centre of excellence for that time. And then the EPPP come and say, well, everyone's going to be an academy, but it's going to be categorised 1 to 4. So almost Bournemouth now are playing catch up. So 14 years, Southampton have been an academy. They know what an academy's like. They've been operating at that standard. So clubs have to catch up, and maybe it is elitist and it's favouring the clubs that are either in the Premier League or have got the finances to resource and fund this. So yeah, I think it's not only the women's game that's probably playing catch up, but I think teams down the pecking order have probably had to play that game too.
And if we look at Bournemouth's status, for last year we went and took a look, and did a little club visit, and they're well on their way. They're a Cat 3 club, pushing to get Cat 2 status. They are trying to get all the plans and the funds. They've got the board up ready. This is what the facility is going to look like, and then they get relegated, and it's going to be tough to make those decisions to keep going. And spending to get the dome, to get all the facilities and everything, and all the staffing that it's going to require to go from one category to another. So, unfortunately, a lot of things in life are set up to benefit the people who are already in charge or in power, and there is a great discussion to be had about how to produce the most elite talent. Do you take the top 1% and keep them competing against each other, or do you raise it up from the bottom up and you make sure that the grassroots level's great, and that pushes every level in between higher? And again, the question of the late developer. I mean, these are we could have long discussions on that. So I guess that leads quite nicely into the actual what is it next? The future game came next after that. Yeah.
So that was around about 2010. So obviously that's 20 years after the winning formula. Probably starting to see a bit of a shift in the style of football that was being seen to be successful and desirable. Obviously, foreign managers, owners coming into the Premier League and wanted to have a certain brand and a way of playing. So yeah, lots of things changed probably between that period, and probably the biggest sort of defining factor on this is the way to go was Pep Guardiola at Barcelona, and the successes that team achieved. Probably in my lifetime, probably one of the best teams. I'm sure similar for you, but that really emphasised that the English game perhaps needed to catch up, and the way that whether it's direct play or long ball or pragmatic football needed to have a little bit of a shift if it was going to be desirable as a product and also successful on the pitch. So yeah, the future game sort of outlined areas where the game was going and where we needed to pay closer attention, and it sort of looked at different nationalities and different ways of playing and things that we could learn from that. And it was probably the precursor to the England DNA, to say that we are England and we've got qualities and traits as a nation which are good, and we shouldn't overlook those. But what can we learn from the likes of Barcelona, from the likes of Spain? Germany at that time was starting to progress and starting to develop players. We look at Belgium now with the players that they're producing, and it was almost to challenge some of the things that were happening, and say, we need to maybe start being a bit more holistic. We need to start thinking about age and stage appropriate coaching. We need to start looking at a bit more fluidity and flexibility in our players, rather than pigeonholing players at a young age and having that premature professional approach. Start to maybe look at different ways of doing things.
But Graham, I mean, England didn't have a left back, or was it was it a right back or right midfielder? Like, there was a position in the English national team that could not be filled. No one could ever get to it. So therefore, the right solution was, well, we're going to train someone and have them be position specific at an earlier age. Therefore, they're going to be great when they get to the international stage. That's somehow logical, yet incredibly flawed, all at the same time. And that's the hard part about some of these assumptions that we make.
Yeah, I think in the future game, it was more about the fact that the game is becoming more dynamic. It's becoming more based upon positional play, rotations. Players need to be able to play. They need to be bilateral. They need to be able to play off both feet. They need to. You're seeing now with fullbacks going into centre midfield positions. Players needed to be more versatile to cope with the modern game. So, yeah, lots of stuff in that document is probably that was around the time where I was starting out as a coach. Certainly in my formative years as a coach, so that was a really important document for me and the way that I like to play. So yeah, there was some good stuff in there. Obviously, Dick Bate passed away a couple of years ago, but very influential at the FA and really forward thinking. He looked at produced some statistics and some data around the need for us as a nation to have a different way, a different style of football, not necessarily direct, but probably more towards a possession-based style, and even having counter-attacking options as well. Because whilst direct play can be successful, if you've got more strings to your bow, or you can produce players that can play in different ways, naturally as a nation we're going to be more successful. So yeah, that was quite an influential document. It was a precursor to the England DNA, which is obviously built upon that and now started to formulate what English football should look like. And that's not just at senior national men's level, but also including the women and also including the different age groups through the pathway as well. So hopefully things are becoming a little bit more joined up, and as a result of that, hopefully we're starting to see more success with academy players coming through that pathway, working towards the national team.
So, okay, there is definitely a consistency amongst the teams because of the document, because of a common language that everyone faces. Especially as an American coach, we looked at other nations and said, okay, well, they're doing something right. We need to emulate that. So the big one was, okay, Ajax is 4-3-3. Every club that we work with, we need to have our identity. We're going to play all 4-3-3. And obviously, it makes sense, and yet it's incredibly flawed. So what has been the repercussions in the English game at the youth level when everyone knows what the English DNA is, or let's say the future game, everyone has this shared vision of, we're going to play out of the back, we're going to produce these kinds of players. Does that replicate, identity, or does that replicate any uniqueness that comes out of it at the club level?
Yeah, I think what the England DNA strives to achieve is it's not necessarily about numerical structure. So obviously Holland is very much synonymous with 4-3-3. So it's not necessarily around what the formation is or what the numerical structure of a team is. It's more about principles. So there's certain principles we want to try and play this way. Within the England DNA, it talks about, first priority is to try and counter-attack. If that's not possible, then it's about possession. It's about keeping the ball. So I think there's almost a couple of plans. So it's like these are our ideals. This is our philosophy. This is the way that we want to play. But players also need to be able to do X, Y, and Z. So I think it's trying to teach principles to players in the national pathway. So if they come into the pathway at 15 and then they move into the 16s, there's not a complete culture shift. It's not a massive change for them. They can adapt to the demands. I think probably what happened previously was when it wasn't so joined up, it was very much about the individual coach or the personality or the personal preferences of that coach, which would influence the style that team played. So you might experience very different cultures between the squads. So the transition between them was difficult. Obviously, what you raised there, the problem is that every club with international players in their squads are then releasing them to go to England, and obviously each club has their own unique philosophy and culture and way that they want to do things. So trying to knit that all together as a national team coach is, I can imagine, very difficult. Does it make England more predictable? Possibly, but then you know what you're going to get from Spain, you know what you're going to get from Holland, you know what you're going to get from Germany, and I guess it's quite cyclical because Germany sort of had that sort of reboot moment where they looked at things and said things need to change, and they had a massive shift, and then on the back of that came success. Spain obviously didn't win much for many years, and then had this change that was influenced by Guardiola, and then had success off the back of it. But then you look at Germany and Spain in the last World Cup, and both teams got knocked out early. So I guess it's not necessarily about having a fixed identity, it's having that identity but having room for evolution. And if we go back to Ferguson, who you mentioned earlier, he had that. He played 4-4-2. He looked to play forward and wide. It was about getting the ball into the box. It was about good football, but he evolved and he knew when he needed to have change and when players needed to move on. So I think it's probably having core principles, core values, a philosophy, but then around that having the flexibility to change and flex with the evolution of the game and with what needs to change to stay ahead or up to date with what's going on.
So I'm a young coach. I'm coming through, and I look up and I see here are the documents that coming off a great World Cup success that Southgate has had with the team. Obviously, loads of success at some youth international levels. So do I replicate and just do what other people have said? And here's the English DNA, here's the future game. I'm going to replicate everything that I do. My principles are going to be their principles because it's been done right. At what level do I steer off and go my own way? Or are we just giving a roadmap for more homogenous coaching philosophy principles? Not to say that this is the wrong way, but how does that come out or across to a young coach?
Probably as a young coach, it gives you, I guess, a framework, an idea, a template of how you want to coach your team and how you want them to play. The danger probably as a young coach is that you're very fixed to that. Obviously we have both now experienced and have had a number of years coaching, and we can start to implement our own identity and what our own ideals. I guess it's understanding that it's not a black and white. It's not this is the England DNA. This is what you need to implement. It's almost a guideline of these are some of the principles that we want English players to be able to do. So being comfortable in possession, stepping out with the ball if you're at the back, being able to play 360, being able to understand when to break lines, things like that. So just general principles, and you can do that in a number of different ways, in a number of different formations. The information that you can give can be different, but I guess the intention is the same. We want to try and develop players that are technically capable of playing in the modern game.
Yeah.
As long as we don't see it as a rule book or a playbook, and seeing it as that sort of black and white, I think it's a good thing. It hopefully gives us a framework which we can then stamp our own personality and ideals on it.
So that's changing those documents really changed the coaching side, and then on the structural, more bigger scale, the macro scale, we've got the EPPP that's now kind of giving guidelines and kind of standards. This is what each club needs to do to accomplish these goals. That contributed highly to the standard of all development in England since 2012.
Yeah. So the EPPP was sort of the modern take on the Charter for Quality. So obviously the Charter for Quality was 1997, and then the EPPP, which was then led by the Premier League as opposed to the FA, then just sort of hopefully brought the youth development rules or landscape a little bit up to date. So very much kept a lot of the things that were in the Charter for Quality, however started to introduce some other things. So there was some things around long-term player development. There was things around being more holistic. Obviously, if you look at academies and football in general now, with the income and the money that's the Premier League has bought, there's a lot more staff now. So being more multidisciplinary or interdisciplinary, what that looks like, having more accountability through reviews. So in the Charter for Quality, it was more of an annual review that you would give to a player. So at the end of the season, you would review their progress, and then it would be a retain or release decision. Now they've broken that down to 6 weeks in the youth development phase, 12 weeks in the foundation phase. So very much the same sort of framework or things there that the Charter for Quality introduced, but hopefully starting to bring it up to date a little bit. Hopefully giving more opportunity for players to progress through the pathway. If you were only given feedback at the end of the year, that may be difficult to action or address. Whereas if you're given feedback on a 6-week basis, you're consistently involved in that development pathway, and you're well informed. So there's lots of things that the EPPP introduced. Probably in terms of an overarching sort of concept, it introduced the different categories. So category 1, category 2, which are sort of early specialisation models. So the opportunity to bring players in at a younger age. Generally speaking, it's Premier League clubs that have those categories. Category 3 was more of sort of a hybrid model, so not necessarily having the players on a full-time programme. They would go to their own schools and they would come in, less contact time, less staff in numbers. And then obviously category 4, which is a late development model, if you like. So you only really run with a youth team, and you perhaps take players that are released from the previous 3 categories. So those are sort of the things that were introduced. And again, probably a problem that the Charter for Quality experienced is a vast number of clubs went for and attained category 1 status. So there's a vast number or a large number of category 1 clubs which may work against the best with the best.
What was it, 24 last year, and then the addition of Palace, I know.
Leeds
other Leeds have gone, so it's up to 26 now. No, it's and we'll get into the Brentfords and Huddersfields and decisions going forward, but there's this natural assumption that obviously everyone wants to be a Cat 1 club.
Yeah, well, I think the strapline was more and better homegrown players. That was the concept. So it was driven by the Premier League, but obviously the stakeholders involved in it. So the LMA, the FA, I think probably the PFA, various stakeholders were involved in it, and it was hopefully a bit like the sort of the German reboot that they had, where it was everyone in it together. The intention, I think, was to involve all the stakeholders for the English game, so more and better homegrown players. Whether that's worked, whether there's too much sort of individual interest from each of the clubs. it probably remains to be seen. To judge it now, only 8 years in, it's difficult in sport to. You almost need a long-term process to really know whether it's being successful. But I guess coming back to your point about the age groups being successful in the World Cups, the early signs are positive, with English players in the Premier League last year being at a elevated level compared to previous seasons. Again, the early signs look positive, but I guess we won't know the real extent of the impact for a number of years.
Yeah, doing kind of the research on this, we all think about 2017, and that is the shining light for English youth football. I mean, World Cup winners at the 20s, World Cup winners at the 17s, Euro champions at the 19s, and semi-finalists at the 21s. And yet, going back and looking, this past year in 2019, the 17s didn't qualify for the World Cup. The 20s didn't qualify for the World Cup. And the 19s only got to the elite round. U21s only got to the group stage. Previous to that, there were a bunch of did not qualifies or only the group stage between the time of 2011 all the way up there. So, yes, it's easy to say we have a great group of players coming through, and we'll get to the Phil Fodens of the world, the Tammy Abrahams, and they had great success during that summer. But as you said, the longer we go, we're going to find out, was that abnormal, or was that a trend? If you look at the Germans or you look at the Spanish, their success at international youth tournaments are pretty much every year, and obviously we see it at the full national teams. So that's a different dialogue that we'll dive into next time. So kind of wrapping it all back around to Thiago Silva's comment about the Premier League and long ball football. We look at it from the developmental standpoint. We see it from just how the Premier League has changed. And you talked about the managers. One of the best examples that I could think of is the types of managers like Big Sam and Neil Warnock. Those managers kind of fell by the wayside. They got relegated, or they had controversy with the English national team. Thank you for he wasn't there with Palace anymore. But then the biggest sign that the change has occurred is you've still got Norwich, who is in the relegation zone, bottom of the table at Christmas time, and they're still trying to play.
Yeah.
They have that philosophy. Bournemouth put in a new kid playing again at goalkeeper, had some injuries, put in this new kid, still going to try and play out of the back. Is it to their detriment? Maybe, but 20 years ago, 30 years ago, that would have been unheard of. The long ball football definitely would have happened. You hired Big Sam, you hired Neil Warnock to save your club from relegation, and you got that bump. And they didn't want you to play out of the back, because that meant you were probably going to give it away and give away a goal. And that those two clubs are a sign of the times. That whether Thiago Silva's right about the English game changing now, maybe it occurred a few years ago. Pep came in 2016. Was the league better then? Had it already changed by that point, or did it only change, in the last couple years?
Yeah, I think there's been a gradual change over a number of years in the Premier League. But I guess with the likes of Eddie Howe, you look at Scott Parker this year with Fulham. Like I said earlier, the best platform to influence change is off of winning. So we want those young managers who have come through and seen this shift towards a different way of English football. We want them to be successful, because then that hopefully will influence change. At the moment, we probably haven't got that. Like I said, Howard Wilkinson being the last English manager to win the elite league in England. That's, I think, 91, 92, I think that goes back to now. So a number of years where we haven't had an English manager win the Premier League, and that's just going to carry on going longer and longer unless we get those quick wins and we see success. So Sam Allardyce and Warnock maybe dropping out of the Premier League might open up opportunities for other managers to come through with different ideologies, different philosophies, hopefully bring success with a new style of football, and hopefully we can really start to see that sea change, because at the moment it's the likes of Klopp and Guardiola that are really influencing it with a different style of football. You talked about Wolves earlier, again, a good style of football. Sheffield United last season, very interesting style of football. So there is, there's more sort of variability in the Premier League. I think if you looked at it 10 years ago, it would have been very bog standard. Generally speaking, same formations, same philosophies, same styles. You look at the German league, so much variability, different formations, different ways of doing things, quite innovative. Young managers coming into the game, and that's probably where the English game needs to get to. It's certainly on the right track and it's improving, but I think there's probably still more work to be done to really change the mentality like Thiago Silva had of England has a certain style or a certain DNA. It's probably not as fixed as it used to be, but it's probably still got some work to do to be regarded as a really attractive brand of football.
So that's your point?
Yeah, I think the point that he's made is, I think there's merit to it. It has always had a stigma, and you coming from America, you'll know that very well yourself. It is improving, it's getting better, and players like him are now willing to sort of go against that stigma and come and actually sample the football here, because he believes it is now a product that he would enjoy playing in. So I think what he said is probably accurate, and what we need to do now is make sure that we continue that momentum to ensure that other players don't see the Premier League as being unappealing as a place to play, because we need those elite foreign players alongside our best English players to really develop the game and hopefully therefore improve our national product and get success on the international stage.
Yeah, I think the biggest takeaway, the biggest point that he's making is it's attractive enough even for a Brazilian to play. I think back to the 90s and Juninho, and it's like, what is this Brazilian doing in this league? He's a magician. It's way too much for him, and I think that's a shining light to the culture shift that has occurred. Not only the Prem can think they play a certain style, but it's really the perception from elsewhere. And it's definitely a positive. I take the point of view of, okay, great, we've just gained another old international at a club that we thought had turned the tables, and Abramovich had stopped spending the money just now. Obviously he was for free, and we get that. But now that replaces, for the exact reason why the EPPP was created, was to make sure that homegrown players have that success, and hopefully that leads into the rest of our kind of series, and we'll kind of keep continuing this conversation on development and especially the English game.
Mm-hmm.
Thanks for joining the conversation. If any of this has sparked an interest in you, check out the resources in the description below to find out more. May the myths be dispelled and the truth stick.